By many accounts, the Erie Canal is considered the definitive engineering marvel of the 19th century. Being a 363-mile waterway through the New York wilderness, it was a crucial transport artery for over 50,000 people. Yet when it was first proposed, the federal government deemed the idea too ambitious, hence the task would fall to the state, which went on to accomplish construction by sheer manpower. This is the story of the Erie Canal. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Our story begins in the 1800s New York with a man named Jess Hawley, born on May the 11th, 1773 in Geneva, Connecticut. He was a child when the colonies rebelled against the British, growing up with the Republic, and by the time he was 30, he moved to western New York State. Here, he made his living by buying grain from the eastern part of the state, processing it through a local mill before sending it back east for profits. This scheme never really brought him much profit, as he always had financial troubles. The lack of income was mainly due to the difficulty of transport, and he wasn't the only one suffering from that problem at the time. It was a challenge that New York and the country as a whole was facing at the time: infrastructure. Early American infrastructure was primitive. There was no such thing as motorways or even cross-country paths. Waterways were the best transport available, and they left much to be desired. The roads that did exist were dirt and would turn into mud after even the slightest rainfall. As discussed in a previous video, Chicago in particular suffered greatly from muddy roads to the point that they raised the entire city several feet. However, Chicago's solution to these problems were still 50 years away from this moment in history. The roads weren't just a problem in the rain either. In summers, travelers had a completely rock-hard path ahead of them, as the sun essentially forged it into a single solid mass. When horses, carriage wheels, or even someone at a brisk pace walked these roads, it kicked up dirt into the air, making any traffic sure to choke on dust. And that's not even mentioning the risks from sources other than the roads themselves. One example is the expression highway robbery. Today it describes when someone feels as if they paid too much for a good or a service, implying that they were robbed. The term originates from bandits on highways that stopped carriages and stole exorbitant amounts of money from them, as there weren't any police patrols out to stop them. Highwaymen, as they were known in Europe, were common sights on early American roads. Also known as road agents, they would terrorize America long into the times of the Old West, until the US government established enough of a presence in these lands to combat them fully with police forces. The roads in America were an absolute mess, and Jess Hawley knew it. However, his eyes were elsewhere at the time. You see, the early 1800s were an exciting time for many Americans, as a new flame ignited their fever for exploration once again. That flame was the Louisiana Purchase, when Napoleon Bonaparte sold the entirety of France's holdings, known as French Louisiana, to the United States. With the signing of a paper and exchange of $15 million, the United States doubled in size. Calling this purchase a steal would quite literally be the underestimation of the century. The United States had gotten away with such a good deal that they could quite literally afford to give away land. However, the people of the states weren't quite so generous. In 1803, Hawley learned of people overcharging for land out west, which angered him to the point that he complained to the authorities. He figured that rather than fussing about with the lower parts of government, he'd take the issue to a head. So he wrote to the then President Thomas Jefferson, complaining about these quote-unquote capitalists slowing development on the frontier. He also had a solution to the issues, proposing a plan to use excess federal funds to mark out towns as ports and assist in their development, claiming that the actions would prevent these land grabs that allowed his hated capitalists to continue their schemes of highway robbery in the modern sense. This plan would assist in the growth of what Hawley called the American Empire. Jefferson likely didn't pay this message much mind, considering it was railing against capitalists and calling for the government to seize the means of production of cities. However, this message does carry historical significance, as it was one of the first calls for the government to step in and assist the people at the expense of the wealthy elite. 3 years after this letter, the debts incurred by the transport inefficiency caught up to him, and Hawley could not pay back the loans he took to establish his business. These loans eventually landed him in debtor's prison, a prison for people who couldn't afford to pay their debts. For context, in debtor's prison, one could work off their debts and the price of their incarceration through prison labor. Hawley spent over a year and a half in debtor's prison, mulling over the circumstances that led to his imprisonment. He eventually came to a single conclusion: one culprit that was the source of all his woes: infrastructure. And as he did when he raged against the capitalists with their land grabs, he began to write. Taking the pen name Hercules, he advocated for Jefferson's plan to work on manufactured waterways and infrastructure after clearing the national debt. In particular, he called for a canal from Buffalo to Albany. These essays began attracting attention from many people in New York, and many agreed with his calls for waterways. These people found many of their strongest arguments from his writing, and when the mask from the pen name fell away, Hawley found wide admiration. After his stint in debtor's prison, he served on the state assembly for a session and gained an official position in the state government. 1806 saw the beginnings of calls for a canal, and they would only get louder and louder. Eventually, a senator would take the cause to Washington. Senator DeWitt Clinton, born March 2, 1769, in Little Britain, New York, grew up with the Revolution, just as Hawley did. Nephew of Governor George Clinton, he had many ties to New York, serving as a state senator from 1798 to 1802, then a U.S. senator for New York from 1802 to 1803, then as mayor of New York from 1803 to 1815. During his service as mayor of New York City, he stepped into the state senate's office for a third term in 1806, to a state calling for a project of previously unheard of scale. By 1809, a proposal was on the president's desk, but the idea of the canal didn't get off to a romantic start. Basically, Thomas Jefferson picked up the document and was utterly appalled. The state of New York was asking for the government's assistance in constructing an over 360-mile canal from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes. This canal would let boats sail from the New York harbor up the Hudson to Albany, then cross the state in an entirely manufactured river, existing from Buffalo to Lake Erie. A project of this scale, even today, would be beyond imagination. Jefferson, seeing the sheer manpower required for something this massive, turned down the proposal, stating that it was quote-unquote little short of madness. Senator Clinton wasn't a man to give up so easily, however. During his tenure, he had constantly gone the extra mile to serve the voice of the people, advocating for free public education, removing voting restrictions on Roman Catholics, and even establishing public welfare in New York City. By 1811, he brought together a new proposal, this time to the New York Senate. He introduced a bill to create a commission to search for the best route for a canal from Albany to Buffalo. To many, this sounded suspiciously like that insane proposal he put to the president. For many in the state, this was a step too far. You see, Jefferson was and remains a popular president, and this blatant disregard of his opinion on the matter was nothing short of disrespectful. The United States of 1811 only had its developing self to rely upon, so massive-scale investments were chosen carefully. American politicians quickly took to mocking this project, with names such as Clinton's Folly or DeWitt's Ditch. All the same, Clinton was politically savvy enough to push the bill through the state. Despite opposition, the commission was approved. Though work on the commission and by extension the canal stalled, the opposition was still very loud, and it was a bit too controversial to continue. Not many political advancements happened at all in 1812, as war had once again come to the Republic. Trade sanctions and other disputes had led to a formal declaration of war from the United States to Great Britain. And throughout the 3-year-long war, an invasion went into Canada, failed, and Canadian and British troops marched on Washington, D.C., burning down the White House. Despite heavy American losses and fewer British and Canadian losses, the War of 1812 ended in a military draw. However, just before peace, the Battle of New Orleans took place, repelling a full-scale British naval invasion aiming to take New Orleans, West Florida, and the entire Louisiana Territory. This decisive victory providing just enough war support to end the conflict on a positive note, also provided the perfect political climate for Clinton to proceed with the plans for his canal. Clinton traveled to Albany, the state capital of New York. There, he laid out his new and refined plans for the canal and fought for their approval. After yet more debate and political maneuvering, the plans were again approved, turning the most ambitious project in the world into a state affair. Since he couldn't get the president's aid, Clinton pushed for the state of New York to complete this project by itself. And now you might be wondering how he would pull it off without the support of the federal government. After all, President Jefferson called his plan nothing short of insanity. Well, he wanted to call upon engineers in Europe to assist, but they were either too busy, too expensive, or dismayed by the mere concept of carving a swath through the entirety of upper state New York without a drop of federal funding. Left with no other resource, the Canal Commission called upon local amateur designers to draft up the plans for the project the rest of the world would describe as impossible. Among this ragtag crew were several self-taught engineers, inexperienced surveyors, and at least one local math teacher. Two chief engineers of the project were Benjamin Wright and James Geddes, two lawyers who got their experience surveying land by resolving disputes. Wright wasted no time in sending his assistant, Canvas White, who we have already learned about in other videos, to study in Europe for a year. White found the teachings of Leonardo da Vinci to be the most useful. What White was interested in was da Vinci's design for canal locks. These locks would lower and raise boats depending on upcoming water levels, which would be invaluable for the varying elevations of upstate New York. Variations of these locks would also be used in the Panama Canal nearly 100 years later. As White returned to America, he assisted in a crucial discovery. Ordinary cement was unsuitable for the canal construction. The constant exposure to water would wear down any typical adhesive until it broke from water damage. Europe had already faced this and created a solution: hydraulic cement. It hardened and remained stiff underwater, making it perfect for projects such as this. However, Europe held its only stocks, and New York couldn't import any due to budgetary constraints. White, faced with yet another hurdle, brought on a colleague named Andrew Barstow to experiment with cement mixes. Eventually, they discovered a local source: limestone. When appropriately prepared, it formed into a widely available and inexpensive hydraulic cement, allowing for the continuation of the project. At this point, the actual progress of creating the waterway could begin. Astonishingly, many of these same engineers took up axes and began clearing the way for the canal themselves. Remember, this was the late 1810s. There was no heavy machinery or power tools. Trees had to be cut down with axes, pulled down with ratchets, and moved away by hand. A ratchet could pull down the entirety of the large ones, but the smaller ones left stumps. Hence, a math teacher named Nathan Roberts stepped in with a solution: a giant stump remover powered by a team of oxen. This contraption increased the amount of removed stumps per day tenfold, from 4 to 40. By Independence Day, 1817, the first ground that would make up the waterway broke. Work began on digging the canal near Rome, New York. This 90-mile strip was towards the center of the canal, with the least number of natural obstacles for the trench. Any rocky cliffs or swamps would make carving the channel infinitely more challenging, so they were actively avoiding them wherever possible. Initially, the state contracted local landowners to hire their workforce for clearing land, 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and holding towpaths on either side. One would think that a state government suddenly forcing landowners to distribute a payroll would be very unpopular, but many were excited about the project. Having an extremely lucrative trade path in their backyards was a dream for some, and they were willing to break the bank to realize it. Wages were 50 cents to $1 today, which translates to around $11 to $22 in today's money. The first days were excruciatingly slow. Every day starting in 1818 would see only a few feet excavated, despite the efforts of 3,000 men and 700 horses every day endeavoring to speed it up. By 1819, the Utica River, now known as Mohawk River, connected with the Seneca River. However, that milestone marked the end of the easy part. Now, the canal faced carving a path through the Montezuma swamps, notorious for its disease-ridden mosquitoes. It was here that the promises of lucrative trade routes stopped being worth the risk, and many contractors abandoned the project. The state had hit yet another dead end. Most of the canal was yet to be carved, but contractors were walking out. Where workers were once everywhere, they now had a significant vacancy. Thankfully for the state, 1820 saw a massive influx of Irish immigrants into New York. Suddenly, thousands of people were fresh off the boat from across the Atlantic and looking for any kind of work out there, and their vacancies seemed very welcoming. The key word here is seemed welcoming. As the canal progressed into the swamps, malaria began claiming lives of workers in droves. Thousands of Irish immigrants passed away from what they knew as Genesee fever, but the project continued as usual. At the beginning of the year, the Canal Commission reported that 3/4 of the canal team were Americans. By the following year, there were so many Irish on this project that they outnumbered even the local populations. Anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment flared in these regions, and their treatment reflected it. On top of dealing with constant fights, the Irish had wages of only $12 a month, or $264 in today's money, and apparently some were paid in whiskey. Despite their treatment, the Irish persevered. They quickly gained a reputation for doing all of the most demanding and dangerous work that nobody else wanted or could do. Blasting open the canal's path often involved black powder, which was known for its unpredictability and could claim dozens of lives if it was placed even slightly incorrectly, and the Irish worked with it regardless. At last, the Canal Commission came to the final challenge, and the most difficult of them all, the Niagara Escarpment, the same rock formation that makes up the Niagara Falls. This was an unavoidable 70-foot-tall cliff blocking the path to Lake Erie. The standard canal locks only went up 15 feet at most, so this was the biggest challenge and the final hurdle, and many had absolutely no idea how to approach it. Fortunately, Nathan Roberts had an innovative solution. Why not just make multiple locks? He drew up plans for a staircase of boats made up of 5 locks, providing just the right altitude to scale up the escarpment. This design proved so successful that the nearby town changed its name in celebration, Lockport. However, there was still one question. Where would they get all the water for these locks? The solution seemed obvious. Lake Erie was right there. However, the Niagara Escarpment was pure bedrock. The only way to clear a path was black powder. So up stepped the Irish to blast the 7-mile path from Lockport to the lake. To avoid using black powder the entire time, the Irish also heated the bedrock with fire and poured ice-cold water on it to crack the rocks, which they could then clean as usual. However, the bedrock wouldn't pose the only challenge. More anti-Irish sentiment found a home in Lockport as well, leading to a violent riot in 1822. Anyhow, the Irish would finish the deep cut, and many chose to settle in Lockport, forming a proud Irish settlement in upstate New York. By 1825, the Canal Commission had done the impossible. The new waterway was immediately put into use in trade and transport, rapidly becoming a vital artery in the American expansion westward. The first boat to traverse the Grand Canal was the Seneca Chief, and aboard it was Senator DeWitt Clinton, eager to travel through what was once called DeWitt's Folly. Through the Erie Canal, the Great Lakes had a link to New York City Harbor, which proved invaluable for cities like Chicago and Detroit. It had become so successful that an extension of 70 feet wide and 7 feet deep was necessary within a decade of its opening. The rest of the world was in utter disbelief. What was once called impossible and insane had been done in little over a decade. The Erie Canal was the first major industrial undertaking of the United States and something that the rest of the world had never seen before. Even more importantly, the canal solidified New York City as the United States' commercial capital. Believe it or not, before 1825, Philadelphia, Boston, and New Orleans were more important. Now, thanks to the new canal, a boat could sail from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean in 10 days. New York suddenly became the gateway to the West for the rest of the world. As time went on, the 19th century would not see an engineering feat nearly as enormous and successful as the Erie Canal. The once self-made bunch of engineers that developed the canal had now become graduates of the so-called Erie School of Engineering, initially just a figure of speech that quantified the sheer amount of learning and experience they underwent to create the canal. However, it became literal, as in 1824, a school of engineering took root at the mouth of the Erie Canal in a town called Troy, New York. This school would become known as the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, the nation's first civil engineering institute. Even though other routes of transport now exist, the Erie Canal is still in frequent use. As larger boats than ever before still pass its waters, the historic marvel is also a popular destination for tourist boats like kayaks and canoes, which travelers use to traverse these waterways. Consider what a special notion that is. This is one of the few pieces of industry the US has from the 1800s still in use, and unlike many of our lost marvels, people still adore it. The United States of America is a truly unique nation, but in some ways, the Erie Canal was one of the first times it showed what it was made of. From its engineers to the Irish ditch diggers, it's a testament that when you empower a basic man with a vision, his capability might even surprise the President of the Republic. With New York as an international entryway, the United States would call to the world, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." For many, perhaps that golden door led straight to the Erie Canal. Before you go, subscribe. Don't miss our video about the lost canals of New Jersey. This is Ryan Socash, signing off.